The formative years of Igor Fyodorovich Stravinsky laid the foundation for one of the most transformative careers in Western music history. Born on June 17, 1882, in Oranienbaum, a resort town near St. Petersburg in the Russian Empire, Stravinsky entered a world already rich in artistic tradition. His father, Fyodor Stravinsky, was a distinguished operatic bass associated with the Mariinsky Theater, and his mother, Anna, came from a cultured family with a strong appreciation for the arts. This dual heritage, musical professionalism on one side and intellectual cultivation on the other, would play a decisive role in shaping Stravinsky's future identity as both a craftsman and a thinker. Despite being surrounded by music from a young age, Stravinsky's path to becoming a composer was neither direct nor encouraged initially. His family, particularly his father, envisioned a more conventional career for him, ideally in the field of law. In accordance with these expectations, Stravinsky enrolled at the University of St. Petersburg to study law in 1901. However, his lack of interest in legal studies was apparent, and he found himself increasingly drawn to the world of music, which had always been a presence in his life, albeit one relegated to the periphery by parental ambition. Stravinsky's early musical education was informal. He received piano lessons and began to explore composition on his own, but he did not initially undergo rigorous academic musical training. Nonetheless, he possessed a keen ear, a strong memory, and an innate understanding of musical structure. His exposure to the performances and rehearsals of his father's operatic environment offered him invaluable experiential learning. This form of organic musical immersion, although not systematic, endowed him with a strong intuitive grasp of operatic and symphonic textures. A turning point occurred when Stravinsky met Vladimir Rimsky-Korsakov, the son of the famous composer Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov. Through this connection, Igor was introduced to the elder Rimsky-Korsakov himself, who would become his mentor. At the time, Rimsky-Korsakov was among the leading figures of Russian music, known for his mastery of orchestration and his work as a teacher. Though Rimsky-Korsakov did not initially regard Stravinsky as a serious student, he agreed to provide him with private lessons, thus beginning a mentorship that would be crucial in shaping Stravinsky's early compositional voice. During this apprenticeship, Stravinsky was exposed to a more disciplined and technical approach to music. Rimsky-Korsakov was meticulous and methodical, emphasizing clarity of form and orchestration. These principles became deeply ingrained in Stravinsky's craft, even as he would later rebel against certain romantic sensibilities. Under his mentor's tutelage, he studied counterpoint, harmony, and orchestration, developing the technical fluency necessary for future innovation. The early works Stravinsky produced during this time, such as Symphony in E-flat major, 1907, display the stylistic fingerprints of his teacher, especially in their brilliant orchestral coloring. Parallel to his technical education, Stravinsky was absorbing the cultural and intellectual currents of turn-of-the-century Russia. The period was marked by intense artistic ferment, including the rise of Russian nationalism in music, literature, and visual art. Composers like the members of the Mighty Handful had established a distinctive Russian style rooted in folk traditions and exoticism, and this spirit filtered into Stravinsky's early musical imagination. While he would later distance himself from overt nationalism, its imprint remained as a foundation on which he would build his radical experiments. Family influence also remained significant throughout this early stage. Although his father died in 1902, the aura of the professional musical world in which Fyodor had moved continued to inform Igor's aspirations. His mother supported his burgeoning interest in composition, offering moral and practical encouragement that helped offset the earlier paternal pressure to pursue law. Stravinsky's social environment, which included musicians, artists, and intellectuals, further stimulated his ambition to create. By the time he reached his mid-20s, Stravinsky had firmly chosen the path of music, having abandoned his legal studies and committed to serious composition. The decision marked a break with a conventional life and signaled the emergence of a unique voice in music. Yet at this point, Stravinsky was still largely unknown beyond the academic and artistic circles of St. Petersburg. He had talent and a growing set of technical skills, but he lacked a platform. This would change dramatically with his first encounter with Sergei Diaghilev, which would catapult him onto the international stage. In retrospect, Stravinsky's early years appear as a crucible of diverse influences, familial, educational, cultural, that forged the raw material of his genius. Though he would later revolutionize musical language, his origins were deeply rooted in tradition. It is precisely this tension between inherited forms and innovative impulse that would define his artistic trajectory. The disciplined training of his youth, particularly under Rimsky-Korsakov, gave him the technical authority to transcend boundaries, while his personal history endowed him with the psychological resilience to take bold creative risks. The figure of Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov loomed large over the Russian musical landscape at the turn of the 20th century, and for the young Igor Stravinsky, he would serve not merely as a teacher, but as a gateway into a world of compositional rigor, intellectual discipline, and artistic possibility. Stravinsky's association with Rimsky-Korsakov began not through formal conservatory admission, but through an informal and highly personalized mentorship. This apprenticeship was to become the defining academic period in Stravinsky's musical development, establishing the technical and conceptual foundation upon which his later innovations would be constructed. Rimsky-Korsakov was by this time an established master of orchestration and a pillar of the Russian classical tradition. As a member of the renowned Mighty Handful, he had been instrumental in shaping a nationalist idiom that combined folk elements with Western forms. However, in contrast to his earlier revolutionary stance, by the time he began working with Stravinsky, he had become more conservative and pedagogically oriented, stressing discipline and structural clarity. These values would become a cornerstone of his teaching philosophy and would deeply influence Stravinsky's approach to composition, even as the younger composer's aesthetics evolved in radically different directions. Stravinsky's studies with Rimsky-Korsakov were conducted privately, as the former had never enrolled officially in the St. Petersburg Conservatory. This informal arrangement allowed for a flexible and intimate dynamic between teacher and student. Their sessions, held at Rimsky-Korsakov's home, focused primarily on harmony, counterpoint, and orchestration. Though Stravinsky showed creativity and independence, Rimsky-Korsakov insisted on a solid technical grounding before allowing room for experimentation. This methodical process of internalizing compositional tools would later allow Stravinsky the freedom to break the rules with authority and precision. What is striking about Stravinsky's time with Rimsky-Korsakov is not merely the acquisition of skills, but the way in which his mentor's instruction helped him sharpen his aesthetic instincts. Rimsky-Korsakov's emphasis on orchestral color, structural clarity, and narrative cohesion left a lasting imprint. Though Stravinsky would eventually eschew the lush textures and programmatic styles typical of his teacher's generation, his own works, particularly the early ballets, display a meticulous attention to timbral detail and orchestral balance that can be traced back directly to Rimsky-Korsakov's influence. One aspect of Rimsky-Korsakov's mentorship that proved invaluable was his insistence on studying the works of earlier composers in depth. Stravinsky was encouraged to analyze scores by Bach, Mozart, Beethoven, and Glinka, among others. This exercise in score study cultivated a respect for formal construction and thematic development, and subtly introduced Stravinsky to the idea that innovation could coexist with tradition. It also planted the seeds for his later neoclassical turn, where he would return to these earlier models, not out of nostalgia, but as sources of structural inspiration. Beyond technical mastery, Stravinsky absorbed from Rimsky-Korsakov a broader understanding of the responsibilities of a composer. His mentor taught him to view composition not as a burst of inspiration, but as a disciplined craft requiring daily engagement and long-term vision. Stravinsky, who would later adopt a notoriously regimented daily routine as a composer, likely internalized this ethic during these formative years. He came to believe that structure, limitation, and order were not enemies of creativity, but its necessary companions, a philosophy that would later manifest in his precision-driven scores and strict stylistic phases. Another critical element in their relationship was Rimsky-Korsakov's role as a gatekeeper to Russia's elite musical circles. Through his teacher, Stravinsky gained access to influential figures and institutions. He attended rehearsals at the Mariinsky Theater, witnessed professional orchestras at work, and was introduced to the inner workings of musical production at the highest level. These experiences gave Stravinsky an education not only in the art of composing, but in the business and politics of the musical world, skills that would serve him well as his career grew increasingly international. Despite this proximity to the traditional Russian music establishment, Stravinsky never became a mere imitator of his teacher. If anything, the final phase of his mentorship saw signs of divergence. By 1905, Stravinsky's compositions began to show a greater degree of rhythmic complexity and harmonic ambiguity, hinting at the more radical language he would later develop. Rimsky-Korsakov, while respectful of his pupil's talents, remained cautious about these departures from orthodoxy. Their relationship remained cordial, but a creative distance was beginning to form. The death of Rimsky-Korsakov in 1908 marked the end of this foundational chapter in Stravinsky's life. The loss of his mentor was deeply felt, but it also created a symbolic opening. Without the towering presence of his teacher, Stravinsky was free to forge his own path, unburdened by the expectations of continuity or conformity. It was shortly after this period that his career would take a decisive turn through his involvement with Sergei Diaghilev and the ballet's Russes, a collaboration that would revolutionize his artistic trajectory. The dawn of the 20th century in Europe was marked by aesthetic upheaval. Nowhere was this more evident than in Paris, where artists, writers, and musicians challenged the boundaries of form, tradition, and expression. Into this charged atmosphere entered a relatively unknown Russian composer whose name would soon become synonymous with musical revolution, Igor Stravinsky. His entry into this avant-garde environment was catalyzed by a fateful collaboration with Sergei Diaghilev, the visionary impresario behind the ballet's Russes. This partnership, forged in mutual ambition, would give birth to a trilogy of ballets that would redefine modern music and establish Stravinsky as a formidable creative force. The genesis of this partnership can be traced back to 1909, when Diaghilev, already an established cultural impresario in Paris, sought to bring Russian art and music to the West. Having staged successful seasons of Russian opera and ballet, he was now looking for fresh musical talent to support his increasingly ambitious productions. Stravinsky, whose orchestral work Feux d'artifice, Fireworks, had caught Diaghilev's attention, was commissioned to compose the score for a new ballet based on Russian folklore, The Firebird. This project, premiering in 1910, marked Stravinsky's first major success and the beginning of a radical stylistic journey. The Firebird blended traditional Russian tales with a vivid, modern orchestral palette. Stravinsky's score was characterized by shimmering textures, bold harmonies, and dramatic shifts in rhythm and mood. While still showing traces of his teacher Rimsky-Korsakov's influence, particularly in its rich orchestration, the work introduced elements that were unmistakably Stravinskyan. Rhythmic unpredictability, sharp contrasts, and an undercurrent of mystical intensity. Its premiere at the Paris Opera was met with critical acclaim, launching Stravinsky into the spotlight almost overnight. Buoyed by the success of The Firebird, Diaghilev commissioned a second ballet, this time centered on the character of Petrushka, a puppet from Russian carnival tradition imbued with human emotion. Premiering in 1911, Petrushka marked a clear step forward in Stravinsky's compositional evolution. Abandoning the lush textures of his previous work, he embraced sharper contours and a more percussive approach to rhythm and harmony. The ballet score was marked by its famous Petrushka chord, a bitonal clash that epitomized the emotional conflict of the central character. Stravinsky's use of folk melodies, treated with irreverent modernism, signaled his growing confidence as a radical innovator. In Petrushka, Stravinsky moved beyond mere storytelling to explore the psychology of his characters through sound. He juxtaposed scenes of bustling activity with moments of introspective melancholy, crafting a musical language that mirrored the fragmented and chaotic world of early 20th century life. Audiences were both enchanted and unsettled. Some critics praised the work's audacity, while others struggled to digest its dissonances and rhythmic complexity. But there was no denying its originality, and Stravinsky was now seen as a daring new voice in European music. If The Firebird and Petrushka had made waves, it was the rite of spring that would trigger an earthquake. Conceived as a pagan ritual set in prehistoric Russia, this ballet depicted a community's sacrificial rites in honor of spring's arrival. Stravinsky's score, completed in 1913, was unlike anything that had been heard before. From its opening bassoon solo, pitched unnaturally high, to the brutal, irregular rhythms of the dance of the earth, the music defied conventional expectations. Harmony, melody, and meter were all distorted to serve a visceral, almost primal energy. At its premiere at the Théâtre de Champs-Élysées in Paris, The Rite of Spring famously provoked a riot. Audiences and critics were divided. Some were outraged by the cacophony and violence of the music and choreography, while others hailed it as a bold leap into the future. Though the scandal of the premiere has become almost mythic, the event underscores the work's explosive impact. More than a ballet, The Rite of Spring was a manifesto, declaring a break with the past and a plunge into modernity. In Stravinsky's hands, rhythm became the dominant force, driving music away from the lyrical and toward the elemental. The innovations introduced in The Rite of Spring went beyond mere shock value. Stravinsky pioneered new ways of organizing time in music. By employing asymmetrical meters, superimposed rhythms, and abrupt shifts in dynamics, he introduced a level of rhythmic complexity that would influence composers for generations. His orchestration, too, was revolutionary. Each instrument seemed to speak with its own distinct voice, and their combinations formed a kaleidoscope of sonic possibilities. In doing so, Stravinsky expanded the expressive range of the orchestra and redefined its role in modern composition. Following the premiere of The Rite of Spring, Stravinsky found himself at the epicenter of European modernism. Though he continued to work with Diaghilev, this Russian period, marked by his deep engagement with national folklore and primitive themes, reached its creative zenith. Stravinsky had transformed folk idioms into avant-garde expression, channeling ancient rituals through the lens of radical abstraction. These early ballets not only made his reputation, but also demonstrated that modern art could be rooted in tradition without being constrained by it. As Europe stood on the brink of World War I, Stravinsky's artistic world began to fracture. Political instability, personal displacement, and aesthetic fatigue with the theatrical grandeur of ballet led him to seek new directions. But before embarking on these paths, he had already inscribed his name into the annals of music history. The Russian period had come to an end, but its echoes would reverberate across the century. Stravinsky had demonstrated that music could not only represent the past, it could violently rupture it, creating a space for something entirely new. The outbreak of World War I in 1914 disrupted not only political and social orders across Europe, but also the lives and careers of countless artists, including Igor Stravinsky. At the height of his fame following the premiere of The Rite of Spring, Stravinsky found himself suddenly dislocated. With Russia entering the war and revolutionary currents destabilizing the empire, the composer, then residing in Switzerland, was effectively cut off from his homeland. This forced exile, though marked by hardship and uncertainty, would initiate a period of personal introspection and artistic transformation that deeply altered the course of his creative life. Stravinsky settled with his family in Morges, a small town on the shores of Lake Geneva. The isolation of wartime Switzerland, far from the cultural capitals of Europe, presented significant logistical and financial challenges. Without access to his Russian income or the Parisian stages that had launched his early success, Stravinsky was thrust into an unfamiliar and austere environment. Yet, it was precisely in these conditions that his artistic outlook began to shift. Confronted with limited resources and stripped of theatrical extravagance, he began to pursue a more restrained and intimate form of musical expression. This new orientation was exemplified by L'Histoire du Soldat, The Soldier's Tale, composed in 1918. Designed for a small ensemble and a portable theatrical production, the work marked a stark departure from the grand orchestral and balletic textures of his earlier period. Drawing on Russian folk tales and structured as a morality play, the piece fused elements of music, narration, and dance. Its score incorporated jazz, idioms, military marches, and ragtime, new influences that Stravinsky had encountered through sheet music and recordings, even though he had yet to visit America. This eclectic fusion signaled his growing interest in cross-cultural experimentation and pointed toward a stylistic reinvention that would characterize the coming decades. The challenges of exile also provoked a more personal transformation. Stravinsky, previously aligned with Russian cultural nationalism, began to regard himself as a more cosmopolitan and stateless artist. The absence of direct contact with his homeland pushed him to sever emotional ties with its political turbulence, particularly after the Russian Revolution of 1917. Stravinsky's distaste for Bolshevism and his rejection of Soviet ideology would later harden into a principled resistance to communist Russia, with which he refused to reconcile even in later years. Exile thus became not only a physical condition, but also an ideological stance, one that would influence his worldview and career decisions. During these years, Stravinsky turned increasingly to religious and spiritual themes, a departure from the folkloric and pagan subjects of his early ballets. Although he had been raised in the Russian Orthodox tradition, his religious convictions deepened during the war and exile years, leading him to compose several liturgical works. Among them was Symphony of Psalms, 1930, a profoundly spiritual composition that would emerge in the following decade as a landmark of his neoclassical period. The war years thus acted as a bridge, transporting Stravinsky from the ritualistic violence of the rite to the sacred reflection of liturgical music. Financial hardship was a constant concern. Without the support of Diaghilev's company, whose activities had been disrupted by the war, Stravinsky relied on grant from patrons and on the performance of smaller-scale works. His economic precarity forced him to explore new avenues for performance and publication, prompting him to revise earlier pieces into chamber versions suitable for modest settings. This pragmatism shaped not only his compositional choices, but also his understanding of music's relationship to context and economy. Stravinsky came to see limitation not as an obstacle, but as a catalyst for innovation. It was also during this period that Stravinsky began to establish intellectual alliances beyond the sphere of ballet and theater. He connected with writers, painters, and philosophers who shared his interest in classical clarity and formal balance. The influence of Jean Cocteau, for example, helped direct him toward a French neoclassical aesthetic, marked by a return to order, objectivity, and historical reference. These dialogues nourished a new creative ethos, one that valued economy over excess, form over feeling, and irony over romanticism. The stylistic break with the Russian period became increasingly evident as Stravinsky embraced neoclassicism in earnest. He began to explore the music of the 18th century, not as an act of nostalgia, but as a way to reimagine modern music through the lens of earlier forms. This was not mimicry, but metamorphosis. By referencing past models, such as the Baroque concerto or the classical sonata, Stravinsky could frame his modern harmonies and rhythms within a disciplined structure. This shift culminated in works such as Pulcinella, 1920, which reworked 18th century material into a distinctly modern idiom and signaled the official beginning of his neoclassical phase. The loss of his homeland also had profound psychological effects. Though outwardly confident and increasingly established in Western Europe, Stravinsky grappled with a sense of cultural dislocation. The composer who had once drawn inspiration from Russian peasant rituals now sought stability in the universal languages of religion, form, and structure. Exile had hollowed out his national identity, but it had also liberated him from provincial allegiance. He was becoming, in the fullest sense, a European composer, a citizen of modernity rather than a spokesman for Russian folklore. By the early 1920s, the European cultural landscape was marked by a general weariness with the excesses of Romanticism and the trauma of war. Artists across disciplines sought to recover a sense of order, clarity, and continuity with the past. In music, this search gave rise to neoclassicism, a movement that rejected expressive extravagance in favor of formal balance, stylistic economy, and historical illusion. At the forefront of this movement stood Igor Stravinsky, who, having weathered personal upheaval and creative transformation during the war years, now stepped into a new phase of his career with a radically reimagined aesthetic. Stravinsky's neoclassical period began with the ballet Pulcinella in 1920, a commission by Sergei Diaghilev that invited the composer to adapt music once attributed to the Italian composer Giovanni Battista Pergolesi. Rather than treating the source material with reverent fidelity, Stravinsky filtered it through his own modern sensibility, reworking harmonies, inserting rhythmic dislocations, and introducing unexpected instrumental colorations. The result was a hybrid, music that retained the charm and structure of the 18th century but was unmistakably modern in its execution. With Pulcinella, Stravinsky inaugurated a personal idiom that would dominate his output for the next 3 decades. The neoclassical approach extended far beyond stylistic borrowing. For Stravinsky, it represented a philosophical stance. He believed that musical expression should be governed by form and craft rather than emotion and spontaneity. This belief stood in direct opposition to the romantic ideal of the composer as a tortured soul pouring raw feeling into sound. Instead, Stravinsky championed the composer as a craftsman, an architect of sound who used tradition not as a constraint, but as a framework within which creativity could flourish. In interviews and writings, he often emphasized control, discipline, and the impersonality of art, famously declaring that music is, by its very nature, essentially powerless to express anything at all. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, Stravinsky composed a series of works that exemplified this new outlook. Symphony of Psalms, 1930, written for chorus and orchestra, combined liturgical solemnity with neoclassical structure. Unlike romantic sacred music, which often sought to overwhelm the listener with emotional intensity, this work offered a stark, contemplative beauty. It reflected Stravinsky's growing interest in religious themes, but filtered them through a modernist lens. Austere, dignified, and meticulously crafted, the piece gained immediate acclaim and solidified his reputation as a master of sacred music in the 20th century. Another significant work of this period was Oedipus Rex, 1927, an opera oratorio composed to a Latin libretto by Jean Cocteau. Its use of Latin, an intentionally archaic and dead language, underscored Stravinsky's desire to create emotional distance. By avoiding vernacular language and expressive theatrical conventions, the composer forced audiences to confront the mythic nature of the story in a ritualized and stylized form. The music itself, with its clear-cut phrasing, stark orchestration, and choral grandeur, evoked ancient Greek drama filtered through Baroque and classical idioms. Stravinsky's neoclassical style did not remain static. As he matured within this aesthetic framework, he experimented with a variety of instrumental and vocal forms. He composed concertos, sonatas, and symphonies that reflected his ongoing engagement with classical genres. Works such as the Concerto for Piano and Wind Instruments, 1924, and the Symphony in C, 1940, demonstrated his ability to infuse traditional forms with modern energy and rigor. These pieces featured sharp articulations, precise counterpoint, and an almost mathematical clarity, qualities that distinguished his neoclassicism from the more nostalgic or impressionistic tendencies of his contemporaries. During this period, Stravinsky also expanded his activities as a conductor and performer, frequently traveling across Europe and the United States to present his works. He developed a reputation for exacting standards and unflinching precision. His own interpretations of his music were characterized by their rhythmic vitality and architectural clarity, further reinforcing his reputation as a composer of structural intellect rather than emotional excess. These public appearances enhanced his visibility and influence, establishing him as a leading figure in modern music, not only in composition, but also in performance practice. The intellectual world of Paris during the interwar years provided fertile ground for Stravinsky's ideas. He found kindred spirits among writers and artists who shared his fascination with classical antiquity and formal order. Collaborations with figures such as Pablo Picasso and Jean Cocteau reflected a shared aesthetic vision rooted in reinterpretation rather than revolution. Stravinsky's neoclassicism, far from being a retreat into the past, became a progressive project, an effort to construct a new musical language that reconciled history with innovation. In parallel to his creative endeavors, Stravinsky became increasingly involved in theoretical and autobiographical writing. His collaboration with musicologist Robert Kraft later in life would produce volumes of reflections on music, art, and culture, But even during the 1930s, he was articulating his philosophy with clarity and force. His essays and lectures emphasized the virtues of tradition, structure, and impersonality, challenging the dominant narratives of romantic individualism and avant-garde rupture. Stravinsky saw his music not as a rejection of the past, but as a dialogue with it, one in which he reserved the right to reshape inherited forms according to his own rigorous principles. By the end of the 1930s, Stravinsky's neoclassicism had become both a personal signature and an influential model. Younger composers looked to his work as a guide for how to navigate the tensions between modernity and tradition. At a time when serialism and other radical movements were gaining prominence, Stravinsky offered an alternative path, one rooted in clarity, craftsmanship, and historical consciousness. His music demonstrated that it was possible to be modern without being anarchic, to innovate without abandoning the lessons of the past. The onset of World War II marked a pivotal moment not only in global history, but also in the life and career of Igor Stravinsky. As fascism spread across Europe and political tensions deepened, Stravinsky found himself increasingly drawn to the stability and opportunities of the United States. In 1939, following the death of his wife Yekaterina, and with the rising threat of Nazi occupation, Stravinsky made a permanent move to North America. This transatlantic transition would not only reshape his personal circumstances, but also immerse him in a vibrant, yet unfamiliar, cultural environment that would influence the final stages of his career in profound ways. Stravinsky's early impressions of America were mixed. Having first toured the country in the 1920s, he was both fascinated and disoriented by its cultural eclecticism and commercialism. Upon settling in Los Angeles, he encountered a landscape far removed from the salons of Paris or the disciplined austerity of Swiss exile. Southern California, with its Hollywood industry and sprawling suburban life, represented a new kind of modernity, less rooted in tradition and more driven by innovation, technology, and mass appeal. Though initially resistant to some of its artistic values, Stravinsky gradually found ways to adapt and flourish in this new setting. Los Angeles in the 1940s was a hub of émigré talent, drawing artists, writers, and musicians fleeing European conflicts. Stravinsky quickly became part of an elite intellectual circle that included composer Arnold Schoenberg, conductor Otto Klemperer, and film score innovator Erich Wolfgang Korngold. Though he maintained a cool distance from most of these figures, particularly Schoenberg, whose 12-tone system he initially rejected, Stravinsky's presence within this émigré network positioned him at the heart of a unique cultural crossroad. These relationships, often tinged with rivalry and philosophical divergence, served to sharpen his musical identity within a foreign context. Despite America's embrace of entertainment and popular culture, there remains significant demand for high art and modernist experimentation. Stravinsky found an eager audience in American universities and orchestras, and he began lecturing at institutions like Harvard, where he delivered the Charles Eliot Norton Lectures between 1939 and 1940. These talks, later published as Poetics of Music, articulated his compositional ideals to a broader audience and affirmed his status as a thinker as much as a composer. His clear, polemical prose challenged romantic assumptions about creativity and reinforced his image as a disciplined modernist. The American period also saw Stravinsky engage in new kinds of collaboration and patronage. One of the most significant was his partnership with the impresario Lincoln Kirstein and choreographer George Balanchine, both of whom had a vision for cultivating ballet in the United States. Their shared work led to several key productions, including Orpheus, 1947, Agon, 1957, and others that combine neoclassical restraint with distinctly modern elements. These collaborations helped establish the foundation of American ballet and further extended Stravinsky's influence beyond the concert hall. Musically, Stravinsky's American years were marked by a deepening of his formal experimentation. Works like the Symphony in 3 Movements, 1945, displayed an angular intensity and rhythmic dynamism that reflected both wartime anxieties and the vitality of American urban life. The composer began to embrace bolder orchestrations and fragmentary motifs, moving away from the serene balance of his earlier neoclassical period toward a harder-edged, more dissonant language. This shift mirrored the complex, often contradictory nature of his surroundings, at once full of promise and haunted by the specter of global conflict. During his American residency, Stravinsky also became a U.S. citizen in 1945, an act that signified his full commitment to his adopted country. While he never abandoned his European heritage or Russian identity entirely, the naturalization symbolized his transformation into a truly international composer, one who could no longer be defined by national boundaries. This cosmopolitan identity allowed him to traverse multiple musical cultures with increasing confidence, positioning him as a global figure in the post-war artistic world. His relationship with the American public was nuanced. While Stravinsky enjoyed critical acclaim and widespread respect, he was sometimes perceived as aloof or esoteric. His performances and lectures drew admiration for their precision, but also occasional bewilderment at their intellectual rigor. Nevertheless, his influence on American composers, including Elliott Carter, Leonard Bernstein, and Aaron Copland, was considerable. His presence offered a living link to the early 20th century avant-garde, while his embrace of clarity and form provided an appealing counterpoint to more radical tendencies in modern music. The final years of the 1940s and early 1950s were also marked by personal renewal. Stravinsky remarried in 1940, taking Verita Basset as his second wife, and together they built a stable domestic life in Hollywood. This stability allowed him to concentrate on large-scale projects and to contemplate the next evolution of his compositional voice. Far from entering a period of decline, Stravinsky approached old age with undiminished ambition and curiosity, increasingly receptive to new ideas and technologies emerging in the post-war musical scene. In the mid-1950s, Igor Stravinsky, now well into his 70s, embarked on what would be the most unexpected and controversial transformation of his career, a turn towards serialism. This compositional technique, built around the 12-tone system developed by Arnold Schoenberg, had long been associated with a school of thought that Stravinsky had previously kept at arm's length. For decades, he had maintained a distinct musical language rooted in rhythm, structure, and neoclassical clarity. Yet, in a remarkable act of creative reinvention, he now chose to explore the very idiom that he had once viewed with suspicion, signaling a final chapter of radical artistic evolution. The catalyst for this transformation was Robert Kraft, a young American conductor and writer who became Stravinsky's close confidant and collaborator. Kraft brought with him an encyclopedic knowledge of contemporary music and an unrelenting curiosity about avant-garde developments, including serialism. Their intellectual exchange, initially professional and eventually deeply personal, sparked Stravinsky's interest in the Second Viennese School, particularly the music of Anton Webern. Webern's concise, pointillistic textures and structural precision fascinated Stravinsky, whose own later music began to reflect these very qualities. Stravinsky's first forays into serial composition did not represent a wholesale abandonment of his earlier principles. Rather than adopting Schoenberg's system dogmatically, he adapted serial techniques to fit his own musical logic. This meant integrating tone rows within pre-existing rhythmic and formal frameworks, and employing them flexibly rather than rigidly. His serialism was uniquely Stravinskyan, lean, texturally transparent, and still deeply connected to his interest in ritual, symmetry, and repetition. It was less an ideological conversion than a pragmatic appropriation of a new tool set. One of the first major fruits of this transition was In Memoriam Dylan Thomas, 1954, a song cycle for tenor, string quartet, and 4 trombones. The work marks a turning point in his output. While not strictly serial, it incorporates elements of ordered pitch structure and reveals a darker, more austere expressive world. Stravinsky's approach here is spare and unadorned, with each note placed deliberately, conveying a sense of emotional detachment tinged with gravity. It reflects his increasing preoccupation with mortality and the metaphysical, themes that would dominate his final compositions. Following this experiment, Stravinsky fully committed to 12-tone composition with Canticum Sacrum, 1955, a liturgical piece written for performance in St. Mark's Basilica in Venice. This work is significant not only for its musical content, but also for the symbolism of its venue. By choosing to premiere a modernist, serial composition in one of Europe's most sacred and historical spaces, Stravinsky was asserting the compatibility of contemporary innovation with spiritual tradition. The piece blends dodecaphonic writing with Gregorian-inspired chant, achieving a balance between ancient liturgical forms and modern abstraction. The culmination of his serial journey came with Thrini, 1958, a large-scale setting of the Lamentations of Jeremiah. Composed for voices and orchestra, Thrini stands as one of Stravinsky's most complex and demanding works. Its bleak tone, austere textures, and rigorous construction exemplify his late style. Disciplined, stripped of ornament, and spiritually introspective. This was not the dazzling color of Petrushka or the rhythmic violence of the Rite of Spring. It was music of contemplation and lamentation, forged in the twilight of life. Stravinsky's serial works continued through the 1960s, culminating in pieces like A Sermon, A Narrative and a Prayer, 1961, The Flood, 1962, and Requiem Canticles, 1966. These compositions displayed increasing integration of 12-tone methods with dramatic and textual elements, often with biblical or moral overtones. Requiem Canticles, one of his final completed works, is particularly notable for its stark, almost ritualistic solemnity. Clocking in at under 15 minutes is a concentrated statement, an epitaph in music constructed with mathematical precision and spiritual gravitas. Throughout this final phase, Stravinsky remained intellectually active and engaged with younger generations of composers and thinkers. His dialogues with Robert Kraft, published in several volumes, not only documented his evolving ideas, but also revealed his openness to change. Far from retreating into nostalgia, Stravinsky's late years were marked by curiosity, humility, and a willingness to challenge his own assumptions. His embrace of serialism, though surprising to many, was consistent with his lifelong belief in music as an art of form and order. This period also altered the public perception of Stravinsky. Once considered an adversary of the serialists and an emblem of rhythmic vitality, he now stood alongside figures like Pierre Boulez and Karlheinz Stockhausen in the pantheon of avant-garde composers. While some critics and listeners struggled with the austerity of his late works, others admired their rigor and philosophical depth. In his final decade, Stravinsky was not merely composing. He was building a legacy rooted in reinvention, refinement, and fearless exploration. In the final decades of Igor Stravinsky's life, one of the most defining aspects of his career was his extraordinary collaboration with Robert Kraft. What began as a mentorship between an aging master and a young conductor evolved into one of the most intimate and symbiotic intellectual partnerships in modern musical history. Kraft, several decades Stravinsky's junior, brought an acute critical perspective, relentless curiosity, and a scholarly discipline that enriched Stravinsky's final years not only artistically but intellectually. Through their shared work, a vast repository of musical and theoretical material was created that continues to shape our understanding of Stravinsky's thought and influence. Stravinsky and Kraft's relationship was, in many respects, an artistic alliance grounded in mutual need, while Kraft found in Stravinsky an artistic lodestar, someone whose daring and breadth of invention shaped the 20th century musical landscape. Stravinsky discovered in Kraft a vigilant editor, a challenging interlocutor, and a loyal advocate. Kraft's rigorous approach to contemporary music kept Stravinsky attuned to evolving trends, while his willingness to record, document, and publish Stravinsky's words elevated the composer's voice beyond the music itself. Their conversations formed the core of a series of publications that offered rare insight into the mind of a composer not known for introspection in earlier decades. Among the most influential of these works was Conversations with Igor Stravinsky, 1959, the first in a series of volumes that presented the composer's thoughts on music, history, religion, literature, and philosophy. Unlike traditional interviews, these texts were constructed as dialogues, often stylized but deeply reflective. In them, Stravinsky speaks candidly, sometimes abrasively, about other composers, critics, and trends. He reveals his admiration for Bach, his complex view of Beethoven, and his nuanced understanding of ritual and symbolism in music. Through Kraft's editorial guidance, Stravinsky's aesthetic positions were clarified and codified for posterity. These dialogues also illuminated Stravinsky's philosophical engagement with the modern world. He spoke with authority on questions of artistic autonomy, the boundaries between sacred and secular art, and the role of the composer as both servant and innovator. In contrast to the romantic notion of the suffering, inspired artist, Stravinsky repeatedly emphasized discipline, structure, and impersonality. Kraft helped shape this portrayal, portraying Stravinsky not only as a creator, but as a thinker, analytical, decisive, and fully conscious of his place in cultural history. Beyond their published dialogues, Kraft played an integral role in managing and expanding Stravinsky's late career. He assisted with score preparation, orchestrations, and rehearsals, and often conducted premieres of Stravinsky's works. This allowed Stravinsky to focus on composition without the burden of logistical demands. Kraft's fastidious documentation ensured that Stravinsky's late works were precisely transmitted and preserved, including complex serial pieces whose structure required careful handling. Their artistic symbiosis reflected not just mutual respect, but a deep alignment of purpose, the preservation and articulation of a modernist legacy. Through their collaboration, Stravinsky also ventured into media and performance formats he might not have otherwise embraced. With Kraft's encouragement, he recorded spoken reflections, participated in film and radio interviews, and granted rare access to his working process. One such instance was the 1965 CBS documentary Stravinsky, directed by Roger Englander, in which Kraft was instrumental in shaping the narrative and music selection. These appearances not only brought Stravinsky's persona to wider audiences, but helped demystify his late, serial works for the general public. Their partnership, however, was not without tension. Kraft's dominant editorial presence, occasionally led to criticism that he imposed too much of his own voice on Stravinsky's writings. Some scholars questioned whether the dialogues truly reflected the composer's thoughts or were filtered through Kraft's aesthetic agenda. Nonetheless, the material that emerged from their collaboration remains unparalleled in scope and depth, offering a first-person chronicle of one of the century's most influential artistic lives. On a more personal level, Kraft became a near-permanent fixture in Stravinsky's household, eventually moving in with Stravinsky and his wife Vera. The relationship, while never fully defined in conventional terms, was rooted in a powerful bond that extended beyond professional collaboration. Kraft often served as a mediator in social settings, a translator in interviews, and a manager in legal and publishing matters. Stravinsky trusted him implicitly, not only with his work, but with his legacy, a trust underscored by Kraft's role as literary executor after the composer's death. The Kraft-Stravinsky partnership also influenced the broader discourse around music criticism and historiography. Their joint writings challenged conventional narratives, introduced new analytical frameworks, and demanded a more critical engagement with the mythology surrounding genius and innovation. In shaping the public and academic view of Stravinsky's career, Kraft ensured that his mentor would not be reduced to the early controversies of the Rite of Spring or the polemics of neoclassicism. Instead, he positioned Stravinsky as a continually evolving figure, whose artistic integrity lay in perpetual reinvention. As Igor Stravinsky entered the final decade of his life, the signs of physical decline became more evident, though his mind remained impressively sharp. Living between Hollywood and New York, and occasionally traveling to Europe for premieres or honorary events, he inhabited a liminal space between active creation and retrospective contemplation. Despite his increasingly frail health, Stravinsky continued to compose, dictate letters, meet with musicians, and consult with Robert Kraft on the editing and publication of scores. These were years marked by a slowing of output, but also by a deepening of reflection, a twilight phase filled with intimate awareness of mortality and legacy. By the late 1960s, Stravinsky's body no longer allowed him the intense labor of composition at the pace he had once maintained. He suffered from chronic respiratory problems, arthritis, and general weakness that often left him bedridden for stretches of time. Still, even as his handwriting faltered and his energy waned, he worked. Often through dictation to Kraft or his copyists, he refined existing compositions, revisited older sketches, and examined proofs with meticulous care. His determination to create remained undiminished, even as the body that had once conducted orchestras and annotated manuscripts gradually betrayed him. During this time, Stravinsky grew increasingly introspective. He became more involved in the curation of his own legacy, giving detailed attention to how his works would be performed, interpreted, and archived. He carefully reviewed recordings of his music and approved certain interpretations while rejecting others that strayed too far from his intentions. This protectiveness over his artistic output reflected a lifelong desire for precision and clarity, but it also suggested an acute awareness that he was nearing the end of his ability to influence the narrative of his own career. One of the final public highlights of this period was his celebrated visit to the Soviet Union in 1962. After decades in exile and an often contentious relationship with the USSR, Stravinsky was invited back to his homeland in a gesture of cultural diplomacy during the Khrushchev thaw. The visit included a triumphal reception in Moscow and Leningrad, where the elderly composer was treated as a national hero. Concerts featuring his music drew standing ovations, and Stravinsky, despite his deteriorated health, was visibly moved by the outpouring of recognition. The journey offered a symbolic reconciliation with the country of his birth and added a poignant chapter to his biography. Back in the United States, he spent much of his time in quiet isolation. While Kraft, Vera Stravinsky, and a small circle of aides and friends remained close, his social world had shrunk. Once a commanding figure in salons and concert halls, Stravinsky now preferred the controlled environment of his home, where music and literature remained his daily companions. He listened to recordings, often analyzing them critically, and continued to read extensively, particularly theological and philosophical texts that echoed the metaphysical themes present in his late compositions. Musically, these years brought the completion of Requiem Canticles, 1966, widely regarded as his final masterpiece. Though only 15 minutes in duration, the work encapsulated many of the qualities of his late style: compactness, serial technique, ritualistic solemnity, and a profound spiritual depth. It was a fitting summation of his creative evolution, a work that seemed to mourn not just the dead, but the very condition of being. Its final movement, Libera Me, was quiet, angular, and haunting, as if the composer were whispering a farewell through a veil of abstraction. As Stravinsky's strength declined, his public appearances became rarer and more ceremonial than participatory. When he attended performances or lectures, he was usually wheeled in, speaking little but observing with keen interest. His fragile frame and halting speech were in sharp contrast to the commanding energy of his earlier years. Yet his presence still radiated the aura of a legend. In one of his last public appearances, he was seen seated silently at a performance of The Rite of Spring, his face nearly unreadable, perhaps lost in memory, perhaps reconciled to the full circle his work had come. In these final years, the question of death preoccupied Stravinsky not with dread, but with intellectual and spiritual curiosity. He often spoke of the metaphysical implications of art, expressing belief in the sacred power of form and order to transcend the temporal. Unlike romantic composers who sought catharsis through emotional excess, Stravinsky's late vision of music was closer to prayer than confession, a solemn, structured offering to something greater than himself. This perspective shaped his reflections, which Kraft often recorded and later published, offering a rare window into the mind of a composer confronting the inevitable end. On April 6, 1971, Igor Stravinsky died in New York City at the age of 88. His body was flown to Venice, as he had requested, and buried on the island of San Michele, near the grave of Sergei Diaghilev. The location was emblematic, a final resting place alongside the impresario who had given him his first great opportunity, in a city whose layered beauty mirrored the complexity of his life. The funeral was modest but dignified, attended by a small group of musicians, family, and close friends. There were no grand orchestras or lavish tributes, only the quiet reverence befitting a man who had transformed the sound of the 20th century. The legacy of Igor Stravinsky extends far beyond the concert hall. In the years following his death, his influence only grew, reverberating across continents, generations, and artistic disciplines. Unlike many composers whose reputations fluctuate with fashion or academic revision, Stravinsky's name retained a firm and almost mythic status. He was not merely remembered as a revolutionary, but as a symbol of 20th century modernity itself, a figure whose life and work embodied the tensions and possibilities of a turbulent era. His music, writings, and ideas continued to challenge, inspire, and provoke in ways that few artists of any field could match. One of the most striking aspects of Stravinsky's legacy is its vast stylistic breadth. He remains a singular figure who successfully reinvented himself multiple times, moving from Russian folklore to neoclassicism to serialism without ever losing his artistic identity. This chameleonic ability made him a model for postmodern composers, who often cited him as an early advocate of aesthetic pluralism. Figures such as Pierre Boulez, Steve Reich, and John Adams all acknowledged Stravinsky's capacity for reinvention as a critical influence. They admired not just his music, but his willingness to challenge conventions and cross boundaries, both stylistic and cultural. Stravinsky's music also found new life in choreography, cinema, and visual art. Ballet companies around the world continued to reinterpret works like The Rite of Spring, Petrushka, and Apollo, bringing fresh conceptual approaches to performances that once sparked riots or scandal. Filmmakers, too, drew on his rhythmic innovation and sonic architecture, employing Stravinsky textures and scores that sought intensity, fragmentation, or ritualistic power. His bold orchestration and jagged rhythms became synonymous with modern psychological drama, used to evoke dissonance, conflict, or psychological unraveling in cinema. Academically, Stravinsky became an enduring object of study in musicology and cultural criticism. His theoretical writings, especially those edited and published in collaboration with Robert Kraft, offered insight into compositional logic, aesthetic philosophy, and the metaphysical dimensions of music. Scholars examined his strict formalism, his resistance to romantic subjectivity, and his paradoxical blend of order and volatility. Debates around his alignment with tradition versus innovation continued to animate classrooms and symposia, positioning him at the crossroads of historical continuity and rupture. Stravinsky's archival presence is equally substantial. Major institutions such as the Paul Sacker Stiftung in Basel and the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C., house extensive collections of his manuscripts, letters, and sketches. These materials offer scholars a detailed view of his compositional process, revealing not only the evolution of specific works, but the overarching strategies that defined his approach to musical architecture. The drafts often display a meticulous layering of ideas, rhythmic cells, harmonic blocks, and timbral experiments that mirror the structural clarity of his finished scores. Technologically, the digital age has further expanded his reach. High-quality recordings, digitized scores, and interactive platforms now allow students and musicians around the world to explore his work in unprecedented ways. Performance traditions around his music have also matured. Orchestras are more adept at navigating the rhythmic complexities and abrupt contrasts that once challenged even elite ensembles. Interpretive approaches have diversified, allowing for historically informed renditions as well as radical reimaginings, each adding new layers to Stravinsky's afterlife. His legacy has also been deeply personal. For many composers, encountering Stravinsky's music marked a turning point, a moment of revelation that music could be both intellectually rigorous and emotionally compelling without conforming to traditional tonal language. Young musicians found in him not just a composer, but a worldview, one that valued discipline over inspiration, form over sentimentality, and artistic integrity over popular approval. His often quoted maxim, "Music is, by its very nature, essentially powerless to express anything at all," was not a rejection of meaning, but a call to precision and abstraction. Stravinsky's influence extended beyond composition into broader cultural thought. He became a point of reference in discussions about modernism, exile, identity, and the role of the artist in society. As a Russian émigré who embraced Western institutions without losing his spiritual and cultural roots, Stravinsky represented the complexity of diasporic experience. His ability to maintain independence, both politically and artistically, offered a model for resistance to ideological pressure, whether from totalitarian regimes or market forces. In this way, he became a beacon for artists navigating the shifting terrain of the 20th century. In popular culture, Stravinsky's name retained a certain enigmatic prestige. He was referenced in literature, quoted in political speeches, and cited in artistic manifestos. His signature spectacles and sculpted profile became visual shorthand for the modern composer. He occupied that rare cultural space where artistic achievement and public symbolism fused, making him recognizable not just to concertgoers, but to those who saw in him a reflection of modern artistic integrity. His image, intense, aloof, brilliant, came to stand for the idea of the artist as thinker, as innovator, as seer. Ultimately, Igor Stravinsky's legacy is not reducible to a single era, work, or ideology. It lies in his relentless forward motion, his refusal to be fixed in time or style. He left behind not just a body of music, but a philosophy of making, one grounded in clarity, transformation, and the audacity to evolve. As generations continue to interpret and reimagine his work, Stravinsky remains a living presence, not in sentiment, but in the kinetic power of sound and structure, forever urging artists to look ahead.